It was a winter night, and I was 15 years old, home alone because my family had gone out for dinner on that cold and dark evening. At first, it seemed quite normal. I turned on the TV, had some snacks, and tried to relax. But as the night went on, the silence in the house became increasingly unsettling. It was around 10 p.m., and even the sound of the TV wasn't comforting enough anymore. The cold air swirling inside the house and the howling wind outside brought to mind scenes from horror movies. For a moment, I tried to create rational thoughts and smile to myself, but then my cell phone rang. The screen displayed unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered the call. "Hello," I said quietly. The silence on the other end was broken after a few seconds by a crackling breathing sound. It seemed like someone had forgotten to breathe, and then the call ended. My heart started pounding. This had to be a prank, right? About 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. I didn't answer and turned off the phone, but the unease inside me was growing. It felt like someone was watching me. I turned off the TV and decided to go to bed. I locked my bedroom door and got into bed. I placed my phone under my pillow and turned off the light. As I tried to close my eyes in the dark, I heard a faint rustling sound in the house. I tried to figure out what the sound was, but my heart was pounding so loudly it echoed in my ears. After a while, I noticed the sounds becoming more distinct. Footsteps from downstairs, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. I opened my eyes and scanned the room in the dark. My heart was pounding as if it was about to burst out of my chest. I reached for my phone to find my charger, and just then I heard the footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I froze in bed and held my breath. I stood behind the door, trying to think about what to do. Countless horrifying scenarios raced through my mind. Suddenly, I felt a presence standing in front of my door. I held my breath and waited. When I heard the doorknob slowly turning, I was paralyzed with fear. As the person started to push the door open, I mustered all my courage and shouted, "Who's there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a deep, cold voice from the other side of the door replied, "You were expecting me, weren't you?" Frozen in fear, I got out of bed and retreated to the back corner of the room. The door slowly opened, and a dark figure entered. It was neither a family member nor a familiar face. The eyes, glowing with a wild look in the darkness, were fixed on me. Gripping my phone tightly, I managed to dial for help. As the call went through, the deep voice said, "You're not alone tonight." My phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Paralyzed with fear, I waited in the corner as the figure slowly approached me. The terror inside me reached a level I had never felt before. At the last moment, sirens blared from downstairs and bright lights filled the room. The door was forcefully opened and the police rushed in. The man immediately tried to escape, but he was quickly apprehended. The police calmed me down and informed me that my family was on their way home. As the adrenaline slowly faded, I realized how close I had been to danger. The police conducted a thorough search of the house and found evidence that the intruder had been watching me for some time. They assured me that he wouldn't be able to harm me again. In the days that followed, I struggled with fear and anxiety. The sense of violation lingered, knowing someone had invaded my safe space. However, with the support of my family and therapy sessions, I gradually regained my sense of security. That night taught me valuable lessons about vigilance and the importance of trusting my instincts. I learned that safety isn't guaranteed, but taking precautions and seeking help can make all the difference in a moment of crisis. I lived way out in the country when I was growing up. My family was also pretty poor. When I wanted to hang out with friends from school, I often had to take very long walks to and from their homes. Using gas for non-essential trips was not something my family did very often. So walking down country gravel roads was something I did quite often. When I was 13, I had a really scary experience. My friend Jack had gotten a Nintendo Entertainment System for his birthday. This was around 1990.
My family had an old Atari 2600, so that was really all I got to play for video games. So I spent a lot of time over at his house that summer playing video games. Really, it was like a completely new world for me. On this one day, I spent the entire day and the entire evening over at his house, playing Castlevania, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Super Mario Bros., and all sorts of others games all day. And before I knew it, it was midnight. Normally, I would have just slept over at Jack's house. It was something I had been doing often anyway. But I had to be home in the morning because we were leaving early to go to church, which was something that my parents deemed essential, and they would not be coming to Jack's to pick me up. I had to leave and walk home. This was a several-mile walk. It could take me about 2 hours to make the entire thing. And the walk was mostly on gravel roads surrounded by thick woods and lighted by nothing but the moon. So I walked down the paved road that Jack lived off of. There was a small convenience store where I turned onto the gravel road that led home. I mention this because I was surprised to see someone on the porch of the store. That store had been closed for a while, and I had never seen anyone hanging around outside it before. I think I stared at and just a little bit too long, which some people consider to be the worst thing. He stared back, but I really could not make out what his facial expressions were. It was way too dark. However, he did get up at one point, and I took that as the sign to not stare at him anymore. I walked past the store and turned onto the gravel road. At this point, I was trying not to look at the guy, but I have to admit, I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. The man walked over to the side of the store, and he was watching me as I was walking. He actually went all the way onto the gravel, and that was the last I looked at him. I just kept walking until eventually I was out of sight of the store. Now, being away from the man at the store was only a little bit of a small comfort. I was now walking down the gravel country road in the complete dark. The trees were dense, and I had a long way to walk without any kind of light. I did eventually get used to the dark and was able to at least see where I was going and to see the trees. But it wasn't the greatest sight, and I also saw things in the shadows that I knew were not there. The scariest thing I ever read was a scene in the book Pinocchio. It was when the puppet was walking through a dark woods and 2 murders lurked in the dark. They attacked him, but he got away. But the scene scared me, and I often thought about it when I was walking through the woods myself. And there was no doubt that I was thinking about it that very night, thinking about the murders hanging out in the darkness in the woods, invisible because they are protected by the darkness and trees. My stupid mind shouldn't have focused on that, I know. But that is what your brain does when you are in a situation like that. I just tried my best to put it out of my mind. As I was trying to think of something funny, or at least less scary, I heard a crunching sound behind me that sounded definitely like someone walking on the gravel. I stopped walking and heard them walking still. They weren't very close to me, but it was quiet that night, with nothing but the normal night sounds around us. "Hey, is someone there?" I asked, squinting and trying to see something in the dark. I got no answer, and I thought about the scary guy at the convenience store. I was already scared from my own thoughts, but this made it even worse. I tried not to think of that, but I just listened to the crunching on the gravel. After a small amount of time, though, the crunching stopped. That wasn't comforting, though. That was just creepy and made no sense. I kept waiting for a little while to see if the sound would come back, but it didn't. So I turned and began walking home again. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but it was quiet for a while. But among the crickets and sounds of other bugs and animals, I began hearing another sound. It was still behind me, but this time it was coming from off the right side of the road. It sounded like someone was walking around in the forest. I just hoped that maybe it was a deer or something like that, but it didn't sound like it. When you lived as far out in the country as I did, you knew the difference between someone walking in the woods and a deer walking in the woods. I knew it was someone who was still a bit behind me, though. My first thought was to pretend I didn't hear it. I don't know why, but it seemed in my mind that acknowledging the last time gave away that I knew someone was following me, and whomever it was must have moved into the woods because of that. So I just kept walking, As I walked, I was hyper-aware of the sound on the person who was walking around in the woods, and I got more and more nervous as the sounds kept getting closer and closer to me. I stopped for just a moment and knelt down. I grabbed a handful of gravel off of the road and put it in my pocket. I grabbed a second handful and held it in my hand. While I was standing back up, though, I realized there were no sounds other than the noises of the night, and I realized he must have heard me stop and stopped too. I wasn't sure what my next move should have been. Should I start walking again? Should I just stand there? What? I was about to take a step when I heard a voice coming to me from the woods. "I know you saw me at the store," it said, in an obvious attempt to not only disguise his voice but to sound scary. "Leave me alone," I replied, scared. I didn't realize my mistake. "Now I know exactly where you are," he chuckled. And then I heard noise coming from the woods. He was coming at me. I took the handful of gravel and threw it in the direction of the noise. I threw another handful and another. When I finally heard a yelp of pain, I threw 2 more handfuls at it. And then I turned and ran. But I didn't run on the gravel. I ran into the left side of the woods and I quickly found myself a really good hiding spot. There was a pine tree and I was able to easily climb up into it. I was still scared, and I realized I had to remain as still as possible. Neither of us had a flashlight, and it was still very dark. I hoped the gravel had hurt him enough that he didn't hear the direction that I had gone in. I did hear some rustling in the trees a little while later, but it eventually went away. And once it was away for good. I don't know how much time had passed, but I figured enough had passed that the guy was gone for good. I quietly climbed down from the pine tree. Instead of walking on the road, I walked on the side of the road. It made my footfalls considerably less noisy. I was hyper-aware of all of the noises around me, waiting for a sound of a man walking around in the woods or on the road. The noises never came, thank God. I kept walking until I eventually made it back to my home. We had a long driveway, and I really wanted to just run quickly down the driveway to the house. But I went quietly. Everyone in the house was asleep. I quietly got into the house and got into bed. It took a long time for me to go to sleep. When I got up, I told my dad about what had happened. He gave me one of his hunting knives and told me to carry it on me, and if it happened again, gut the guy. That was sort of the guy he was. I mean, if the guy had come up to his house, he probably would have gotten a shotgun down his throat. I never had an experience with the guy before. The convenience store had been robbed, and I told the owner about what I saw, but it didn't help. I never got a good look at the guy, so I guess I can't tell you that I never saw him again. If I did, I would have had no way of knowing. My name is Michael, and I've been working at this cemetery for 10 years. Initially, night patrols and grave diggings used to unsettle me, but I've grown accustomed to it over time. The most disturbing aspect of this job is the realization that anything unusual can emerge in the cemetery. One night last week, the air was dark and silent. The moon was hidden in the sky, with stars casting a faint light. The silence of the cemetery enveloped the surroundings oppressively. I began my night patrol, flashlight in hand, checking the tombstones when suddenly I heard a sound. As cemetery workers, we're accustomed to hearing sounds, but this time the sound was different, like a faint murmur mixed with the whispering wind. I advanced to find the source and saw a colleague standing beside an old, neglected grave. "Joe, is that you?" I asked, but received no response. My colleague's face was pale and troubled, eyes staring into emptiness. I approached with concern. "What's wrong?" I asked again, but still no answer. Suddenly, my colleague's eyes turned towards me, and he began to speak slowly, his voice filled with sorrow and darkness. "I've been here for a long time," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "This cemetery belongs to me. It should belong to me." These words shocked me because I couldn't imagine Joe saying such a thing normally. We had never experienced anything like this in all the years we've spent in the cemetery. But now, Joe's soul seemed trapped here, disconnected from the past. "Joe, I'll take you," I said, reaching out to help him. But Joe's face was expressionless and distant, as if he couldn't hear me. For a moment, I felt helpless, unsure of what to do. Joe's condition disturbed me because he was no longer just a friend. He stood before me as a presence in the cemetery. I called out to him again, but still got no response. Finally, I had to step back. I was alone in the cemetery, and Joe's presence still lingered around me. I retreated in fear and waited through the night without hearing another sound. Since that day, working in the cemetery hasn't been the same for me. I still feel like Joe's soul wanders here, disconnected from the past. This experience deeply affected me and taught me to be more cautious when wandering the cemetery. A few nights later, Joe's presence became more pronounced. During night patrols, I began to see his silhouette in the corners of the cemetery. Once, I heard footsteps approaching rapidly, and when I turned, I saw Joe's pale face staring at me. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, as if searching for something. "Joe, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. But Joe just quietly approached me, his face expressionless. I took a step towards him, but he suddenly stopped and whispered to me, "Help me. I don't want to stay here." These words shocked me, and my heart began to race. Joe's presence and his helplessness stood before me as a mysterious entity wandering the cemetery. But this time, there was more than just his suffering soul. I felt something was wrong in the cemetery, something beyond my control. As the night progressed, the wind intensified, and I heard a chilling scream from the gravestones. I quickly looked around and noticed Joe had disappeared suddenly. I held my breath for a moment, scanning the cemetery, but found no trace of Joe. The next day, the unsettling atmosphere in the cemetery persisted. When I spoke to other workers, they shared the same concern. Some mentioned strange sounds and sightings they'd experienced recently. They hesitated to discuss what was happening in the cemetery, fearing the buildup of their own hidden fears. A few nights later, while patrolling the cemetery alone at night, I saw a shadow for a moment. When I turned quickly, I saw Joe's pale face staring at me again, but this time, something was different. His eyes gleamed with fear and helplessness, as if something was trying to harm him. "You need to run," Joe whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not safe here." Suddenly, several shadows appeared around me and quickly moved among the gravestones. My heart began to race, and I stepped back trembling, but the shadows continued to approach me with each step. I started to run in fear, passing through the gravestones, feeling the shadows chasing me quickly. For a moment, I held my breath and hid behind a gravestone, watching the shadows silently move around me. Holding my breath, I waited for the shadows to disappear. I feared something would happen at any moment, but a few minutes later, the silence returned and the shadows vanished. I slowly looked around and saw no trace of Joe's presence. Since that day, walking alone in the cemetery has become difficult for me. Joe's presence and the strange events in the cemetery still disturb me.